My name is Ted Kooser. I have lived here in Lincoln since the fall of 1963. I came here to go to graduate school. I had taught high school for a year in Iowa. Came to Nebraska because I had an assistantship in the English department at the university. I wanted to be a poet. At that time there was no creative writing program up there. It was a regular master's degree program. And I didn't do very well with that. All I cared about was writing poems, and Carl Shapiro, who had been Poet Laureate, and at that time they were called consultants in poetry, but he'd in effect been a Poet Laureate, was teaching here and had been the editor of Poetry Magazine in Chicago. He was a famous American poet, and I wanted to learn from him. So I spent that whole first year hanging out with Carl Shapiro and doing nothing that I was supposed to do in the graduate school. And so at the end of the year, they took my assistantship away and sort of showed me the door. And I had to find something I could do to support myself. My wife at that time, my first wife, was teaching out of Malcolm. And so we had some income, but I had to find some sort of work. And I went to work for Bankers Life Nebraska, which is now called Emeritus. Took an entry-level job there. And with the idea that I would make enough money that I could pay my own tuition and finish my master's degree and so on, which I did over a period of about 5 years, taking night classes. Sometime in there, it was during Helen Busalis's administration, I decided that I would like to be on the library board because I've always loved libraries. And so I went to Helen Busalis and asked her if she would put me on the board. And she did. So I must have still been living in Lincoln when I went to work to help the Heritage Room. Matter of fact, I may have still been on the library board at that time. That's probably what happened, It's a long time ago now, 25 years, I guess. And so at any rate, Carol Connor, I would guess, approached me and asked me if I would help out with the Heritage Room, and I said sure. And the first year, I remember we thought of various things we could do to raise some money, and I dreamt up the idea of having an annual spelling bee and a few other little things, and we kind of fumbled along, and then someone had the brilliant idea to get Jane Geske to be the next president, and once Jane took over, it really started to move. She was tireless about fundraising and so on. I was never very good at that kind of thing because I don't like asking people for money, but Jane didn't have any problem with that at all. And of course, the Junior League was very important all through this. The people who, like me, were once young, we had a lot of vitality at that time, and they did a marvelous job, coming up with various projects and so on, and so we had a pretty good time of it, and I would, even though Jane was president, I would from time to time help out one way or the other if I could, and so on. Then as I said, in 1984, we moved out to Seward County, so I would have left the library board at that time, and tried to keep in touch with the Literary Heritage Association, but was not as intimately involved after we moved out there. Well, I suppose the spelling bee, I got the idea that it might be something that would be fun, that it could be something we'd get some good community participation in. The idea of an adult spelling bee appealed to me because I knew that there were people who were very competitive about spelling ability, my wife included. Anybody who had worked on a copy desk at a newspaper was that sort of thing. And so we thought we'd give it a try, and we did the first year. And I think everybody may have been a little bit skeptical about how well this would work, but it was very well received. In the first few years, we had it at places where people could drink, which made it even more fun. Then there were people who weren't comfortable with that environment, and they wanted a little bit more space rather than being crowded into the back of a bar and so on. So it sort of tried at different venues over the years. I think my wife won one of the early years. Yeah, we have a photograph of her standing on stage. Scott Young was the moderator that year, and so on. But it was all in all, it was a great deal of fun. I remember, we had regular meetings, trying to come up with ideas and so on. None of us exactly knew quite what to do to try to make this work. But we were getting to know each other too, and kind of assess each other's talents and skills and that sort of thing. So, it was time well spent. We really didn't generate a whole lot of revenue for the Heritage Room, though. Jane Geske would have been much more involved in building the endowment. Now, Wilbur and Elizabeth Gaffney, I think, left a sizable amount of money to the Heritage Room. They were friends of mine, were a couple who had no children and no heirs, and so that was in keeping with what they believed in. Wilbur was a long-term professor at the university and so on. Well, sure, I think I remember every time I was here, and of course remember attending readings here too, trying to support the readers. It's always been a good series, I think, and Shirley is the most long-standing of the series in town. We've had a reading series at the university, but that's another thing altogether. It was always, never a huge crowd, anything like that. But it was always very successful, and it gave local writers an opportunity to, try out their things and so on. And I remember it being called the Poetry and Fiction Series, but I'm very vague on who we had here and so on. I remember readings by Roy Scheel, Marge Sizer. We had Bob McEwen come in once. That hasn't been too many years ago, I think, and so on. Some poets from outstate. And then we also had, from time to time, would have somebody come in and speak on a subject that it wasn't their own creative work. I remember one of my old high school friends from Ames, Don Watkins, who taught foreign languages at the University of Kansas, came up once to talk about translations of something that he did and so on. So there was some diversity to that. Yeah, I don't recall the changing the name to the John Ames Reading Series, but I would assume that what happened was that Gene Ames gave us some money for it. And I knew John Ames. He worked at Bankers Life, Nebraska when I was a young man just starting out there. And the Ameses, that family, of course, is a very old, established Lincoln family, and they were always very supportive of cultural events of all kinds. And I remember Gene Ames coming to our reading series here a lot, over the years, as an older woman, and they were really fine people. Yeah, I would like to say that I think the activities in the Heritage Room have been, very important as supporting the Lincoln literary community, offering a venue where writers who might not have the opportunity to read could do so, which it was the only show in town like that for a long time before Rex Walton started up the Crescent Moon series and so on. And so it was it was really a fine way of helping out writers and so on. I certainly appreciated the opportunity to be a part of it all that time, and I would guess that all those writers who came here enjoyed what they were, that situation. As to my own involvement with the Heritage Room and the reading series and so on, I've been so very busy in the last few years, going here and there, and doing poetry readings all over the country and so on, that I have not been a good attender of them, and I regret that. I've had a number of opportunities to read up here in the, during the past few years. The Heritage Room would approach me and ask me if I would, do a reading, and I felt that I was getting so much exposure in Lincoln that it really didn't make much sense for me to take up a slot, when there were so many other writers that needed the exposure and so on. So I've sort of held off on that, and but if I live another 10 years, maybe I'll do another one, so. On this this current evening, I'm going to read a long poem based on the Blackhawk War that I wrote. The Blackhawk War was 1832, and it's a poem set in the voice of a foot soldier in the Illinois Volunteers who was involved in the Blackhawk War. The Blackhawk War is a very fascinating time because here it is, 1832, it's 30 years before the Civil War, but all of the principles of the Civil War were there fighting the Indians. Lincoln was there, Jefferson Davis was there, General Winfield Scott was there, Zachary Taylor was there. They all showed up for this thing. And then, of course, within 30 years, they were fighting each other. And that was an interesting thing. And it took place during Andrew Jackson's Indian removal period and so on. So I thought I'd give it a try. I've never read this publicly anywhere around here, and I thought it would be an opportunity for me to show people that I can write some other things other than the poems that they've heard 100 times. So, well, I might, I would like to be on record as saying that, we have a really vital and healthy literary community here in Lincoln, and that there's some really fine writers here. When I came here as a young man, in the whole state of Nebraska, if you could have found 3 poets who were publishing work in literary magazines, it would have been something. And now, there might be 40 publishing in, quality literary magazines. And part of that's due to the fact that the university's developed a creative writing program, but also it's due to things like this. It's due to the Heritage Room and, various venues, readings at Kearney, readings around the state and so on. And the original writers who were here years and years ago have nurtured a lot of these younger writers. I mean, Bill Clefcorn has been instrumental in moving a lot of young writers forward. Don Welch at Kearney also. Roy Scheel, who has taught at Doane for a number of years, is another one of those people who's been a inspiration, I think, for younger writers. We've got a solid literary tradition in this state. It's just the fact that in a state of our size, I once tried to figure it out that it seemed like there were about one poet publishing work of high quality for every 250,000 people. And if you look at the Dakotas, we have, let's say, 1.5 million in Nebraska, so that would be 6 poets. And South Dakota's half as many, and it just turns out that there are about 3 poets up there who are doing that kind of work. And North Dakota has half as many as South Dakota, and there are 1 or 2 poets up there who are doing it. So, I mean, surely there could be more poets in 250,000, but that's sort of the way it shakes out, I think. And Kansas, I don't know what the population of Kansas is. I think it's a little bigger than Nebraska, but I don't know. It's one of those wacky statistics that sometimes you dream up that really don't mean a whole lot, but they're fun to talk about.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out this evening. It's good to see you all. My name is Meredith McGowan. I am the curator of the Heritage Room. I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames Reading Series. The reading series has been in existence for 23 years, I believe. This is actually our 175th reading this evening, so I'm glad you're here to enjoy that with us. We are here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors. It's a representative special collection dedicated to promoting and preserving works by and about Nebraska authors. There are about 13,000 volumes in the room at this point, representing about 3,000 Nebraska authors. And we do invite you to come back. We do have regular public service hours, Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3, and Sundays from 2 to 5, in case you want to look around a little bit more, check the writings, or look at some of the artwork that's on the walls, and just enjoy a great atmosphere. We'd like to also thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, because we're able to bring special programs like this one because of an endowment established through their volunteer efforts years ago. Tonight our reader is Ted Kooser, and Ted has many accomplishments, but I thought tonight I'd like to focus on connection with this room. A little bit of background. The addition that put this floor and the fourth floor with the auditorium was done in 1978, and I believe that's when the room took over this, the collection was put into this space. And it was, I think, just called the Heritage Room at that point, and it was supported through the library budget. Well, as funding issues go, in 1981, it was cut from the city budget. And so at that point, there were some questions about how we could keep this going and so forth. Apparently, the Junior League of Lincoln stepped up and supported the Heritage Room until there was some kind of permanent fund. And that's I think, when that endowment was started and took over. A group of community leaders in July of 1982, and the planning continued the formation of the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association in December of 1982. And that leads up to the point that Ted was on the founding board, and he became the first president of the organization. So it had a good beginning that way. And also I noticed that in the newsletter, he contributed notes about literary events. And he may remember that, but that was his contribution to the first newsletter. And then in 1989, Ted received the LHA's Literary Heritage Award, which is given each year at the Mayor's Award banquet. As far as readings go, I thought he had quite a few readings, but it turns out he does have. In early 1984, there was a series started, the Ames Reading Series. It was started here in the Heritage Room, and it was called the Poetry and Fiction Series. And Ted was one of the readers that first year, December of 1984. And there is a tape of that in case anyone would like to see what he looked like in 1984. And it's checkable, and it's downstairs in the video collection. So that might be kind of fun. Then in June of 1985, the series was renamed John H. Ames Reading Series. And he did do an Ames reading in November of 86, and I believe there's a tape of that as well that you could check out and watch if you'd like to too. Then he had a little gap in there, and in April of 99, he joined Twyla Hanson and Marge Sizer and Roy Shield in a special program called Plain Sense Things. So it kind of looks like he's on a 10-year cycle. And here he is back again in 2008. And we're glad to have him back for another reading. And if you would please help me welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to recognize a couple people here tonight. One of the people who has been sort of behind the scenes, but always guiding us in the development of this Heritage Room, is our retiring library director, Carol Connor. And I'd also like to have you give a hand to somebody who is at the center of Lincoln's literary activity. Here is somebody that all of our activity is coordinated by, and everything in a very informal way on a volunteer basis. That's Rex Walton back here. I told Meredith that if it's true that I'm doing these things on about a 10-year cycle, I'm going to be 69 in April, and chances are not good that I'm going to be here in another 10 years. But I'm going to try something tonight that's a little bit different. Many of you have heard the poems that I've been reading in the last few years, and this is a poem. I've read this long poem only once. I read it in California several years ago. How many people in here are familiar with the Blackhawk War? Know about the Blackhawk War? The Blackhawk War took place in 1832, and it was during President Jackson's Indian removal period. Blackhawk and his tribe of Sac and Fox Indians were forced out of their homeland in Illinois and moved over into Iowa. But Blackhawk didn't want to leave the graves of his family and ancestors in Illinois, and so he and a number of Indians went back across the river and into Illinois, and there was great consternation about this from Washington all the way down. And Jackson mounted an army that grew ever bigger during the Blackhawk War. Originally they sent out a few hundred troops, then they added a few hundred more, and by the end of the Blackhawk War, which lasted a very short time, there were something like 1,500 troops in the field after these 200 Indians who were fleeing from them. They went up, if you were looking at a map, they crossed the river in the Quad Cities area and went up the river to along where Dixon, Illinois is, and then they curved up through Madison, Wisconsin, and then came back out on the Mississippi River where the last battle was. And all along they were pursued by this army. And this poem is a poem based upon historical information that I gathered over the years, and I was fascinated with this because my grandparents lived on the Iowa side of the river up close to where the Battle of Bad Axe was, the last battle. But what I did was I invented a character here, and he is a foot soldier in the Illinois Volunteers, and he is keeping a journal, and this poem is a record of this, in effect, is the journal that he writes. Sunday, July 1st, 1832. Cloudy with warm rain most of the day. Marched all forenoon over open ground, skirted by woods and cut by muddy, flooded streams. Fine yellow soil for farming, were it not for the likes of Blackhawk. Crossed many old trails and passed by the ashes and rags of long, cold camps, gray in the rain. Blackhawk leaves signs behind, corn tassels tied to twigs and such like. What is he trying to tell us? When we started, we had 15 days' stores packed on the horses for those with mounts, the same loaded on wagons for us as are all day on foot. Some bacon and flour, and 60 head of cattle. Half of this is gone, for it was supposed we would catch the Indians in a matter of a few days. We are weary now, and camped in open country near enough to Rock River to carry water, defensible in all directions. Today is the Sabbath, and near me a young man whispers into his Bible. Back home, my Betsy will be at services with Mother and Pauline. There's a little shade to the officers' tents and a stand of cedars. I heard General Atkinson's aide, a young lieutenant raised in Kentucky, Albert Sidney Johnston, say he'd never seen a cedar tree before. At the river, we found tracks where the Sacs had been fishing just hours before. I might say that one of the fascinating things about this little war was that nearly all of the principal figures who were to fight on both sides in the Civil War were present. They got there. Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott, Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, all these men were there. Lincoln never met Davis in the field. Lincoln had left by the time Davis got there, but they were just that close to meeting one another at this thing. And I just mentioned Albert Sidney Johnston, who was a great Civil War general. Monday, July 2nd, 1832. Clear, wind out of the west, 82 at sunrise. Last night, one of the lookouts shot into the shadows, thinking he saw an Indian. We were ordered into parade, but were never attacked. This morning we'd gone but a scant 2 miles or so when another was seen at a distance, no doubt the same as was prowling about near camp in the night. At Dixon's Ferry Landing, General Atkinson divided the men, sending Posey's 1st Volunteer Brigade and Alexander's 2nd across to follow the north bank toward Lake Koshkonong, where Blackhawk waits, or so the Winnebagos have told us. Our company of Illinois volunteers goes north with Posey. Governor Reynolds and his staff keep to the south rank safe. Somebody drew up a map of a place called the Island and showed it around, surrounded by swamps and approachable only by a neck of low ground. It is toward this place that Blackhawk and his people are reportedly moving. His many women and children slow his progress. We have 1,400 men, or so they tell us, more I think, some Army but mostly volunteer militia, and a party of nearly 100 friendly Potawatomis. A few desert us every day, the volunteers that is, going back to their farms. Marched all forenoon without any water, then stopped midday at the springs where Rachel and Sylvia Hall had been traded back to the troops. The water was foul, but all we had. I saw a pole stuck in the ground surrounded by straw. It had been scorched in a fire, and the carcass of a young white dog hung up by the neck with tobacco tied to its tail. These signs set some of the men to praying. I found a stone mortar the Indians had used to grind their meal, and I intend to keep it to show to Betsy. It weighs 7 or 8 pounds, and I may get plenty tired of packing it. The scouts said Blackhawk was only a few miles ahead, and we advanced at a run. I heard some firing, but learned it was only some of the Potawatomis shooting a deer. We camped for the night so as to be fresh for a fight in the morning. General Atkinson ordered the breastworks to be thrown up, which was easily done, for we were in thick timber. I sleep easy on the hard ground after an all-day march. Tuesday, July 3rd. Warm and clear, mosquitoes thick in the shady hollows. Marched all day, north and east. I found a copper boiler left by the Indians, but my heavy stone mortar is keepsake enough. Last night, one of the sentinels shot another, thinking him for an Indian. He was on watch, but wrapped in a blanket against the mosquitoes. Shot in the thick of the thigh. At first it was thought the wound would be mortal, but the bleeding stopped by dawn. They took him by wagon back to Dixon's Ferry. I sent a letter to my Betsy with them to post. By late morning, we'd marched into the swamps at the foot of Lake Koshkonong, where the men on horses had trouble with footing. Swampy, bottomless ground. We found a large encampment Blackhawk had deserted just before, a place that had been used for many years by the signs. Big heaps of clamshells, 4 feet across and a foot or more deep. Many fire pits, tent poles, and a painted flagstaff with mad designs in black and red. Somebody found several fresh graves and an Indian cadaver laid out on a wooden trough. Some took a look, but I stayed back. Meriwether Lewis Clark, the son of Superintendent Clark of St. Louis, aide-de-camp to General Atkinson, searched the opposite shore of the lake with his telescope and spotted 3 Indians in canoes. Our scouts found the scalps of 5 white men and 2 human skulls, supposed to be ancient St. Vrain's and another of his party, but all of the features had been boiled away. A man named Whistler arrived with a letter today saying 200 Menominees are asking to join us. Wednesday, July 4th. I ground some corn and oats in my mortar and made a kind of flatbread. The others teased me, but they all wanted a piece. All-day parties were out to either side of the lake following old trails. We found an old blind sack, nearly a skeleton, no teeth and all dried up, who had fallen behind. He was questioned long, but was no help. He told us most of his people were anxious to turn back across the Mississippi where they could be safe, having little left to eat but tree bark and roots and the little birds and fish they were able to catch. 3 of our men lost horses in the swamp. They got down in the mud and couldn't be pulled free and had to be shot. The mud is black as pitch and thick and stinking. Another party, fording a flooded stream, lost pots and pans, a blanket, some buckets, and so on. We have been ordered to conserve provisions, what little we have. Every day there's talk of supplies and reinforcements on the trail to us. Some of the others are looking for acorns for me to grind for bread and mix with a little flour. But this time of year, most have gone bad or been eaten by squirrels. We hear there was trouble between some of the officers about who is in command. General Dodge presented his pistols butt first to Colonel Hamilton, the son of Alexander Hamilton, and offered to fight him, but Hamilton would not, having learned, I suppose, from his father's death at the hand of Mr. Burr. Our Major Dement tore up his commission when we voted to remain under Brigadier General Posey, rather than go over to Colonel Dodge. Most were fearful that Dodge would drive them to the front of the fighting, for he is said to be a vigorous leader. I wish sometimes our own Captain Abe Lincoln had not turned back when his term ran out. He'd have us laughing despite the misery. He used to take off his coat and let us try to wrestle him down, 3 at a time against him. All legs and arms that man is, strong as an ox, and yet he reads books and practices law in Springfield. Thursday, July 5th. Cloudy, heavy showers of rain, very hot by midday. Yesterday, more friendly Indians reported to Colonel Dodge, Menominees led by their war chief, Neetanikak, and some Winnebagos too under White Crow or Blind. These Winnebagos make me uneasy with their skulking ways. Almost 100 degrees by noon and the insects thick near the water. Some of the men are fevered and covered with bites. I don't have any louses yet, but the ticks and chiggers are eating me. It is said that President Jackson is angry that Blackhawk has thus far eluded us despite our many troops. John Robb, his Secretary of War, has written and said, Blackhawk and his party must be chastised and a speedy and honorable termination put to this war. Our sergeant read us the letter and tried to cheer our spirits. General Posey's lead scout led us to Kakakimak, an old sack who had been left behind with some food because he could not keep up, and some of our men stayed behind to kill him. I heard the shots, too many. Now we have shot an Indian, our first. I didn't much take to the notion. Friday, July 6th, clear weather all day. We arrived at a stream of swift, muddy water called the Peel Bark, deep with swamps to either side. 2 men lost horses crossing. Those of us who swam were lucky to get over. I'm drying my things on a thicket of berry canes. It feels good to be naked in the warm sun, despite the mosquitoes. Betsy would laugh to see me. This place is called by the Winnebagos the shaking ground because of the peat beneath. Blackhawk is only 2 days ahead of us, and our commands have come together for the march. The friendly Indians are holding a war dance at the other end of the camp. I can hear them holler. Saturday, July 7th. Ground fog this morning because of the water nearby. 5 of the Winnebagos crept away before first light, cowards or spies. Blackhawk is near us now. One of the men was hit by 2 balls, but not mortally. He'd gone to the stream to catch some fish, and some Indians fired from the brush across the water, then ran. These swamps surround a lake, a widening of the river, perhaps 4 miles wide with 6 or 8 in length. We make bridges of cut grass across the mud and water, the grass being very tall and abundant here. I saw the governor wading up to his shoulders in mire and water. He seems a good sort. We find many signs, mats, kettles, steel traps, all things too burdensome to carry. General Atkinson has been removed from command because I suppose it is taking us too long. The President has no patience. General Winfield Scott has been directed to Chicago to lead the operations, and the government has ordered out 21 companies of regulars. Sunday, July 8th, cloudy, misty, and warm. Some of my chigger bites are swollen and pussy from scratching, and I had chills in the night. A Winnebago chief, Decore, otherwise known as White Crow, tells us that Blackhawk is still on the island back downriver. Can Decore be trusted? I don't like the looks of him. General Scott will be coming from the port of Chicago with 1,000 more men and artillery pieces, though the cannons won't help on this boggy ground. Scott's men will bring our force to 3,500 or so, I believe. About 2,000 are volunteers like me with no experience. Blackhawk has 800. Because provisions are now so scanty, on written orders, we're marching back down to the peel bark to wait for reinforcements and supplies. Once more back through the bogs. Monday, July 9th. Clear and a little cooler with a breeze from the north. It seems we are always within a few miles of a fight, but Blackhawk eludes us. I have long been ready for this to be over. Colonel Hamilton and some Menominees rafted across the white water and scouted the island. They found some fresh sign, but no Indians. They tell that Blackhawk occupied some boulders there and would have surely ambushed us if we had come. This may have been a plan he made with White Crow, who seems the very devil, though Atkinson still listens to his consul. He now says Blackhawk is 12 miles up at what the Indians call the Tumbling Land. I saw Captain Lincoln. It seems he was left at Peel Bark to write the mustering out of Captain Early's spy battalion. Somebody stole his horse and he plans to walk back to New Salem, about 250 miles. But he was merry enough and said a good riddle, but I forgot it. General Atkinson has ordered fortifications built, but General Dodge says he came here to fight Indians and that his men won't help. Tuesday, July 10th, clear with a north wind. We seem to be stuck here in the swamps, not going one step forward or back, and the Army is blaming us volunteers for the lack of supplies. They tell that wagons of provisions are mired and abandoned somewhere behind us. The sick have been sent home, and because the Potawatomis eat so much of our rations, all but 24 have been sent away. A fellow named Fanchier shot a rock dove today, and we took a gill of flour and made a good soup in an old tin bucket left behind by Blackhawk. Betsy would laugh to see me bake and cook. Wednesday, July 11th, 1832, General Atkinson believes that Blackhawk is now some 30 miles ahead of us, and Captain Harney says he saw signs upriver where Indians dug for roots and stripped tree bark and butchered horses for meat. But Zach Taylor's regulars, who are with us here, have been building a stockade of fallen trees and a ditch all around. The Army makes work to occupy idle hands. Friday, July 13th. Clear with a northwest wind. By now my 5 acres of corn should be well tasseled. We are told that 36 wagons full of supplies are en route. Captain McCree and 50 men found a recent camp along the lake, and 12 or 15 Indians fled in canoes and hid in the tall rice grass. Saturday, July 14. Another clear and pleasant day. A detachment has been set to accompany the wagons back to our encampment, spent all day cleaning gear. I found a sharpened stake in the forest with one end dipped in blood. Sunday, July 15. Clear with a light south wind at 8 in the evening. I have to do this writing late, for we are ready at sunup and march all day. A group of about 40 hungry and dirty Winnebagos headed by Bad Alligator is here. In exchange for flour, General Atkinson has the use of their canoes. It is said they left Blackhawk's encampment only 2 days ago. Monday, July 16. We have heard by letter from General Winfield Scott that out of 190 men and 2 artillery companies, 80 have Asiatic cholera and 20 are dead. Therefore, we will not see reinforcements from that quarter taking the field with us. They're to stay at Chicago, but the 36 wagons arrived with provisions, and we have salt and flour. Tuesday, July 17. Whilst lying here, we have thrown up a strong stockade flanked by 4 block houses for the security of supplies and accommodation of the sick. But now that we are supplied, we set out after Blackhawk soon. We heard today that the Galenian newspaper says, quote, "There is not a man, white or Indian, in our camp who knows 1 inch of the country in which he is operating." White Crow is to lead us to the enemy's camp. Thursday, July 19th. Marched 12 miles yesterday, a thunderstorm during the night. The horses stampeded and overturned wagons and overran tents and men. My blanket is hung on a bush to dry. Friday, July 20. Cloudy with an east wind. 90 horses are unaccounted for. Brigadier General Henry has located Blackhawk's trail and is in pursuit. We wait for marching orders. The sick foot soldiers and crippled horses are being sent to Dixon's Ferry. Some of the troops under General Scott are said to have deserted, fleeing the cholera. And a message from Fort Gratiot says dead deserters are strewn along the road, food for the hogs. We foot soldiers are lucky not to have to look to horses. They take more care than men. Saturday, July 21st. East wind, cold and beating rain. Tired and sick for home in Betsy. Forced march all day over muddy ground. Dropped my gun in a creek and had no time to dry it. Sunday, July 22nd. Clear weather, 66 degrees. We are drying our gear. Word came down that ahead of us, Colonel Dodge and his men engaged the enemy in the Wisconsin Heights. General Henry coming behind. The Indians had tied themselves to their horses so as not to let them fall into our hands and fought fiercely, but they were no match for so many. A man from up ahead told us the first kill was Dr. Filios, a doctor and publisher of the Galenian Weekly. Shot and scalped an Indian he had found drawing a bead on some ducks. He was found to be carrying a gold watch taken last month at Blue Mound from the body of George Force. The Indians fell back at nightfall and hid in the wet cane grass along the Wisconsin, dragging their dead behind and throwing them in the river. Our army could not pursue without wetting their guns. After the battle, there was a race to see who could get the scalps. The Winnebagos scalped 11 and the army took 13. Many of the dead were Kickapoos. They guess at between 40 and 60 dead. Only one soldier was killed and 8 wounded. Our dead man's name was Short. Word comes down the Indians have escaped across the river by swimming and making rafts of their mats and skins to float the children over. It is said that Blackhawk and Neopope, a Winnebago holy man, run toward Prairie du Chien, there to cross over into Iowa where Keokuk will meet them. They left their horses and took elm bark canoes, but many tipped over and some of the children drowned. All this is miles ahead of us, and I have yet to fight at so much as a single lick. The only Indians I've seen are old and sick and wearing white napkins on their heads to beg for mercy. Monday, July 23rd. A chilling rain all night, marching in higher country. The soil is better underfoot and less mosquitoes. Cup oak, low briars, and grass. All but a few Potawatomis have been dismissed and sent back to Chicago. We now have only Chambly, Billy Caldwell, Wabanasi, and Parrish LeClaire. They tell after the battle, in the dark of the night, an Indian, Blackhawk perhaps, or Neopope the prophet, was heard to call out in a loud voice near where the soldiers had set up camp. What little was understood was an entreaty for peace, Nicam Pielio, meaning we fight no more. But General Henry would hear nothing of that and ordered a march at first light. The next morning, at the foot of a tall tree from which he may have spoken, they found the tomahawk buried. Blackhawk, encumbered by women, children, and baggage, has managed to cross a river in the presence of 3 regiments, near 3,000 men. We bring up the rear, on foot and slow and weary, hauling axes and augers for rafts for General Henry. Tuesday, July 24th. Strong northwest wind. Heard that the first sack killed was a man seated on the grave of his wife, recently dug. He bared his breast, a willing target. This was the man earlier said to be shooting ducks, which was a falsehood. Wednesday, July 25th. We are at an empty place called Helena and have pulled down what buildings there were and built rafts across the Wisconsin, which is very wide here with many islands. All of the generals are here, but there has been a great falling off among the men, some having lost horses and others on sick report. We are hoping to get supplies from Galena before we cross the river. I try not to whine, but would like to run for home. Thursday, July 26th. The steamboat Enterprise, with a crew of 25 and a 6-pound cannon, is said to be on the Mississippi to cut off Blackhawk as he tries to cross to Iowa. They have gone upriver to break up the canoes of the Winnebagos to prevent Blackhawk from making use of them. Friday, July 27. To get our 1,300 across the river on rafts is holding us up, and Blackhawk has 5 days' advantage. A Mr. Creighton claims our detachment destroyed his crops, consisting of 10 acres of oats, 4 acres of corn, a half acre of wheat, and 3/4 acre of potatoes. I can say if some of us did that, I never got a taste of any. We're going to be eating our horses soon. Saturday, July 28th. 2 men fishing near here found a dead Indian in the water. They threw their dead in the river to keep them from being scalped by the army. The Indian's trail is found about 5 miles in from the river, 4 days old. Deep tracks from 3 columns headed downriver. Colonel Dodge drew his sword and galloped in circles, peering at the ground. General Atkinson following. You would have thought Blackhawk was right near, so excited they were. We then set out and marched 12 miles before nightfall. Sunday, July 29th. The Indians are killing and eating their horses as they flee. This is rolling, timbered country, hard marching through the brush. 5 Indian canoes were found abandoned along the river today. They're made of elm bark and are very flimsy. The Indians had left them under fire from a gunboat that had come upriver. One warrior was shot and fell into the water, but his body floated off before he could be scalped. Monday, July 30th. Clear and cooler with a northwest wind. The steamboat Warrior has come to anchor at the river's mouth, or so we hear. Blackhawk will be cut off there. Marched 15 miles today through hilly country, white walnut trees so high a marksman would have trouble shooting a squirrel out of the top. The horses have no food but weeds and saplings, and we have had to leave our baggage wagons behind due to the heavy timber and mires. We have begun to find many dead Indians, men and women alike, pitiful creatures, it appears, as if they fell, wounded and starved, right off their horses onto the trail. The smell is terrible in the thick timber. Their dead horses have been butchered, leaving nothing but paunch and hooves. The Indians have stripped bark from the maples to sustain them. This is a lonely and disheartening country, and we are lonely and disheartened men. Tuesday, July 31st. In camp, 10 at night, under a clear, starry sky. The Winnebagos brought in some prisoners, women and children. One woman, part Menominee, said the men with Blackhawk have split off into their own band so as not to be encumbered by wives and children. Blackhawk intends to cross the Mississippi above Prairie du Chien, and Keokuk is to meet him at a red cedar there. Wednesday, August 1st. More dead Indians today, all in everyday dress. 30 of our horses gave out and had to be left behind, but at day's end we came to the Kickapoo, or Bad Axe River, and handsome open country with clear springs and grass. The past 3 days our horses have been living on weeds. Blackhawk's sign was fresh, campfires still smoking. I counted 11 dead Indians along the trail. We came upon one dead warrior, painted red and propped, sitting up against a tree, and an old sack who had been left behind. He could speak English and said the others would cross the Mississippi tomorrow. The question was whether to leave him or leave him to starve or shoot him. He was shot. General Atkinson sent word to Prairie du Chien to bring the steamer Warrior with flour, pork, a 6-pounder, and 5,000 rounds of cartridges. And we have heard this night that it came upon Blackhawk at the mouth of the Bad Axe, where he had been stopped for lack of suitable canoes. He raised a white flag and asked to come aboard, but was fired upon 3 times by canister. Those on the hill said the Indians fell like grass before a scythe. The Indians commenced to fire and fall back into the trees, and one of our soldiers was wounded, a ball in the knee. We march up in the morning. Thursday, August 3rd. Fighting all forenoon in the sloughs by the river, all mud and fallen timber under a cool early fog. Most of the fighting was in advance of our troop, but I saw enough. Hundreds of us against a few of them. I fired as ordered, but hit nothing but a few fistfuls of leaves. One squaw tied her baby to a piece of cottonwood bark and pushed it away to float downriver to safety, but big-toothed John House took deliberate aim and shot the child dead. I cannot tell Betsy of this. Another woman was shot while nursing an infant. The ball pierced her breast and broke the child's arm, which Dr. Filio amputated after giving the child a biscuit to suck. Many of the dead Indians were women and children, many shot while clinging to ponies in the water. Some of them made it across the shallows and onto a low willow island. Colonel Zachary Taylor ordered a charge. One young soldier picked up a red Indian sash and tied it on, and must then have been mistaken for an officer and shot dead from deep cover. Some of the warriors laid in shallow water with only their mouths and noses out, but were spotted and shot. One of the friendly Menominees was killed by accident when he ran ahead to touch one of the fallen sacks, as is their way. Some of our men cut strips of skin from the fallen warriors to make razor straps. Blackhawk and the Prophet are nowhere to be found. Friday, August 4th, I was told this morning of an Indian woman who swam to safety in Iowa, carrying her naked baby by biting into its neck the way a cat will carry kittens. The prisoners, about 80, have told us that at the early battle on the bluffs, that night we heard the voice. They called out using the Winnebago tongue, saying that if we would let them cross over the Mississippi, they would cause no further mischief. But it seems no one was with us who understood that language. I think they don't want to understand. It is said 5 soldiers killed and 18 wounded. 150 Indians killed and 100 good horses were captured. The best of them were sold for $5 or $6. I would have bought one to ride home, but have had no money nor needed any. The steamboat went back to Prairie du Chien and brought back a dentist from the east who pulled teeth from the Indian cadavers to make dentures with. One of our Winnebago friends is wearing a finger crooked over his forehead, tied there with strips of skin. A band of Sioux have asked permission to pursue Blackhawk and his remnant of warriors wherever they have gone. Permission granted. The Menominees are dancing, the women parading before the seated men and shaking scalps. They stamp and lean forward as if to touch noses with the men. The war for us is over, and we never saw Blackhawk, who is said to be small and shaves his head, but for a scalp lock dyed red. I had a good long swim in the Bad Axe, which was cold and still swollen with rain. Tomorrow at dawn, we take up a line of march for Dixon's Ferry, all of us of merry heart.